Crime is often reduced to headlines. Criminal psychology looks beyond them. This series examines real criminal cases through psychological theory, behavioral analysis, and ethical reflection. Each case is presented independently, not to sensationalize, but to understand. Welcome to Criminal Psychology Case Files.
So, here's the question we're tackling today. Was Raman Raghav one of India's most notorious killers, a cold, calculating criminal? Or was he a man whose actions came from a deeply fractured mind? All right, let's unpack this whole case using a psychological lens to try and separate the man from the monster. All right, let's set the scene. We're going back to the 1960s, to the city we now know as Mumbai, but back then was Bombay. Now, Bombay was this bustling, vibrant place, right? But underneath all that life, this deep, creeping fear started to take hold. Why? Because there was a mysterious killer on the loose. I mean, can you just imagine the atmosphere? There was this presence that just haunted the night, a shadow moving through the streets, striking the city's most vulnerable people while they were asleep, and then just gone, vanished before dawn. The terror was real. You could feel it in the air. And you know what happens when there are no facts, right? Fear takes over. And that fear, it just gave birth to all this folklore. People started whispering that this killer wasn't even human. Seriously, they said he could change his shape, that he could become a cat or a bird. Basically, some kind of unseen evil force. So the media steps in and gives this phantom a name, Raman Raghav. And of course, they gave him a super sensational title, one that would stick for good: India's Jack the Ripper. And just like that, a monster was born, right there in the public's imagination. Okay, so that's the myth. But let's push all that aside and get to the hard facts. Who was the real man behind all those terrifying headlines? Get this. After he was finally caught in 1968, Raman Raghav confessed to a staggering 41 killings. 41. Just let that sink in. 41 lives, all seemingly ended completely at random. But here's where things get strange. When investigators started looking closely at the crimes, a really puzzling pattern started to emerge. His victims? Mostly homeless individuals. The method? He'd attack them at night while they were sleeping, and the weapons weren't anything special he brought with him. They were just blunt objects he found nearby. So the how was consistent, but it all felt, well, really opportunistic, not planned out. And this is the part that truly stumped everyone, especially the investigators. There was no robbery, no sexual assault. He didn't even try to flee the city. You look at these attacks and there's just no conventional motive. No greed, no lust, no revenge, nothing. So when you don't have a clear motive, what happens? Society does what it often does. It creates a monster. It's the only way to make sense of something so unexplainable. This is actually a textbook example of what sociologists call a moral panic. But that's the public reaction. A forensic psychological analysis, well, that asks us to look deeper, to get past the panic. So let's actually deconstruct that serial killer label and see if it even fits here. Okay, so in criminal profiling, there are two key ideas you've got to understand. There's the modus operandi, the MO, that's just the how of the crime. And then there's the signature, that's the psychological why. The MO is just functional, it's what gets the job done. But the signature, that's what tells you what's going on inside the killer's head. Now with Raghav's crimes, he had a pretty consistent MO, right? But, and this is a huge but, they had no psychological signature. None. There were no special rituals, no personalization of the crime scenes. And that points very, very strongly towards what's called disorganized offending. It suggests his actions were driven by impulse and a severe mental illness, not some kind of careful, diabolical plan. And that's what makes this case so unusual. If you look at the data on why most serial killers do what they do, the vast majority are driven by things like enjoyment or money. Psychosis as the main reason, that is incredibly rare. So Raghav was a total statistical outlier. So if it wasn't a typical criminal motive, then what was driving him? To even begin to understand that, we have to try and look inside his mind. And the only way to do that is through the psychiatric evidence. When he was being interrogated, Raghav gave this this absolutely chilling explanation. He said, "I acted under instructions from God," or kanun. Now, kanun is the Hindi word for law. He genuinely believed he was part of some separate, divine legal system. From a clinical standpoint, what Raghav was describing is a classic symptom of severe psychosis. It's called command hallucinations. Basically, hearing voices that tell you to do specific things. So in his mind, he wasn't choosing to kill anyone. He believed he was being compelled to do it. Now, at first, the medical assessments were kind of inconclusive. But then, a special medical board was put together. And after doing a really extensive evaluation, they uncovered the truth. This wasn't the mind of a criminal. This was the mind of someone who was deeply, profoundly disturbed. And their diagnosis was crystal clear: chronic paranoid schizophrenia. I mean, he was experiencing all the classic symptoms: delusions that people were out to get him, grandiose beliefs about himself, those command hallucinations we just talked about, and just severely disorganized thinking. To put it simply, he wasn't operating in the same reality as the rest of us. So that leads to a huge question, right? How does a legal system even begin to handle a case like this? You have these monstrous acts, but the mind behind them is completely broken. Well, legally speaking, a crime has two main parts. First, there's the actus reus. That's the physical act itself. And second, there's the mens rea, which basically means guilty mind. You have to have criminal intent. You need both of those things for a conviction. Now, there's no doubt Raghav committed the physical acts. That's the actus reus. But his psychosis, his schizophrenia, it meant he simply didn't have the capacity for a guilty mind. The mens rea was missing. He couldn't rationally understand that what he was doing was wrong. So the court turned to Section 84 of the Indian Penal Code. You can think of this as India's version of the famous M'Naghten Rule. It's the legal standard for insanity. And the core question it asks is this: because of a disease of the mind, was the person incapable of knowing that what they were doing was wrong? So based on all that overwhelming psychiatric evidence, the High Court reached its verdict. Raman Raghav was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The death sentence he was initially given was changed to life imprisonment, which he would serve in a mental health facility. So, think about the journey we've just been on. We started with this fearful myth of a shape-shifting monster terrorizing a city, and we ended with the tragic clinical reality of a man suffering from a severe, untreated mental illness. At the end of the day, the legal system made its call: insane, not evil. But this case, all the way from the 1960s, leaves us with a question that feels more relevant today than ever before. Where do we, as a society, draw the line between criminal responsibility and a public health crisis? And maybe more importantly, what's our responsibility to those whose minds are fractured?